Welcome to our introduction to Erasmus, the Prince of the Humanists, the great thinker of the Northern Renaissance, as it's called. He was born around 1466. He kept fiddling with the date because he was, in fact, the son of a priest, and he wanted to get his birth before his father's ordination to major orders. But we think it was 1466. He died in 1536. His parents died in the plague while he was a teenager, so he didn't have a lot of options in life, and in the end had to join the Augustinian canons regular. So, like Luther, it's in the Augustinian family, which is very appropriate. Western Europe is a conversation about Augustinian ideas, one way or another. He's inescapable. So humanism gets this standard division between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. Often we'll call the Northern humanists the Christian humanists, which is useful in some ways and not useful in others. That is, the humanists of Italy were Christian. They were serious believers. Petrarch was a serious believer. Salutati and so on. I guess Machiavelli would be the only one where one would put an asterisk there. But the difference in why you might call the Northern Renaissance more Christian is that, unlike the humanism of the Italian city-states of the northern part of the peninsula, they were looking to the classical models, especially Cicero, but they were looking to the ancient world to figure out practical ways to train the citizenry to deal with crises, right? Salutati and Bruni, they thought, how do we deal with the Milanese crisis? And that it would keep going, that how is it that we can get the kind of political savvy to deliberate well together and to come up with practical ways to secure the common good. That was a movement that required some educated lay persons, and so you have the tradition of lay education in Florence and so on. That did not exist north of the Alps. You have very little literacy outside of the clerical class. You have no longer these great city-states. North of the Alps, you've got the territorial monarchy. So you've got a different political context, one which is not as participatory, to put it mildly. So if one is a humanist in the northern regions of Europe, you're going to try to do the humanist project with a different emphasis. The goal of all Renaissance of the humanists was ad fontes, right? To go back to the fonts, to the sources. And the Italian humanists, they were going back to especially the pagan great thinkers. But the Northern humanists, the Christian humanists, they were going back to those thinkers too, but it wasn't as pressing for them to get a civic ideal. They were going to St. Augustine and St. Jerome and St. Chrysostom and St. Ambrose, men who wrote beautiful Latin, but they were being drawn upon to deal with the exigency of reform, the need for reform, and that's in the church. Because the political wasn't really available to them. They had a different reform agenda. So politics needed to be changed, but it wasn't really something that they could work on. But these are pious people. They didn't have, even though the Italian thinkers are generally Christian and serious Christians, there's this kind of Italian way of being able to live in two worlds, to be secular and then to be religious. But the Northern European mind was deeply pious and just needed to see the changes that needed to happen in the Catholic Church. So Erasmus was a cleric who wanted to be very serious about remedying the corruptions that he saw. He wasn't blind to it. So he brings up a different model of dealing with the crisis of Europe than the one presented by Luther. Luther is a different temperament. He's a hothead. Erasmus was not a hothead. So the question I would like to ask as we think about this great figure, can one advance necessary reforms moderately? If we think about that in our own situation, socially, politically, we see things, any one of us sees things that needs to be changed in our own lives too. We could do it in a fire-eating kind of way, burn it all down kind of way, or we could do it in a way that's moderate. And I think the moderate way is generally correct, and if we think that, then we're going to probably learn something from Erasmus, who was a man given to contemplation. He was an intellectual's intellectual, and that's what he loved to think. He did want that to change life, but it was, the weight of it was in that change in interiority that's brought about by just paying attention to reality, by study, by kind of a deliberate way of proceeding. So he wanted to deal with the institutional renewal that was necessary in the church, always necessary in any institution. And so he advocated a philosophia Christi, a philosophy of Christ. And that really does draw on, if you think of Pierre Hadot and his way of reading the ancient philosophers. I mean, that's what we're talking about, an existential change, where philosophy means a way of life, a way of living differently. And he was seeing this as opposed to, even though he's a trained theologian, he's putting that against theological obscurity. He would see theologians, professional theologians, as in fact serving to enable at least the corruption of the church, being lost in concepts as opposed to living a simple pious life. So for Erasmus, it was a matter of the more one studies, the more one is in contact with the beauty, truth, and goodness of reality, the more one's life will become more serene, simple, and less corrupt. So this he wanted a docta pietas, right, a learned piety, and that's a very beautiful thing, I think, for an intellectual to advocate for. So this is something he also learned from the brethren of the common life, like Luther, and so this is something that they share. The humanists obviously brought into circulation something that hadn't really been seen since the Carolingian Renaissance, right? Philological work, to be able to do enough close language study to be able to take texts and try to correct them, right? Up until just a few decades before Erasmus's birth, the only way you have a manuscript is by copying it by hand, and you get necessarily errors and interpolations. And so philology, the scientific correction of texts, is something that the humanists worked on. And I mean, just it's worth noting here, it was definitively settled by a humanist right around the time of Erasmus's birth by a Catholic priest, Lorenzo Valla, that the donation of Constantine, which was the basis for the papal claim to temporal authority, saying that when Constantine went to his new Rome, his Constantinople, he signed over to the Pope temporal authority over the Western Roman Empire. Well, Lorenzo Valla, this priest, definitively showed through philology this was just a forgery from actually the Carolingian times. So that's important. So the philological work that Erasmus embarks on was perhaps the most important project to date, and that it really is something. He was taught in his early schooling. He was taught Greek. That was rare to get it beyond the university level down to more primary education, and he benefited from that. And he came out with the first printed Greek edition of the New Testament. Print had only come into existence around 1440. The printing press using movable type. The printing press had existed in China, but it was Gutenberg, presumably it's not all locked down, but it seems that this man, this mechanical genius, came up with a way of using metal movable type, and that was the Great Revolution, which would in fact give one of the basic ways that Western Europe could gain preeminence in the world. At this time in the world, and China was the preeminent civilization, but this the printing press with movable type is about the most important innovation you're going to see. It would cause increasing literacy and change the whole tenor of Europe to make it a continent of ideas. Sometimes great ideas, sometimes really horrible ones, but it was always a new public was being created, a republic of letters, as we hear with the Enlightenment. So in 1516, he comes out with what he calls originally the Novum Instrumentum. Instead of the New Testament, he was being a little coy with some of his changes. Instead of in the beginning was the word, he says in the beginning was speech, and so on. He got in trouble with some of his changes. But what he did was he took some manuscripts. It wasn't the best scientific work, but he did collate some manuscripts to get a Greek edition facing a Latin, which was an update of Jerome's translation in the Vulgate, which was, of course, the basis of all Catholic theology and sacramental worship up to that point. This was a few years later. He came out with another edition, and that edition would be the basis for Luther's own German vernacular translation of the Bible. And by that work, Luther was doing what Dante did for Italian. He's setting a template for the German language. That was Erasmus's work that he was basing it on, and in fact, the Textus Receptus that the King James Bible was based on, the beautiful English translation, is derived. That's this edition that of the Greek that is the basis. Martin Luther was greatly influenced, obviously, by this work, and in fact, that made him want to bring Erasmus over to the reforming cause as he was carrying it out. And when, in the end, Erasmus refused to break with the Catholic Church, right? He always maintained communion with the Catholic Church. Luther, in a typical kind of fashion, was furious with Erasmus and started this one-time hero. I mean, really, you can see it, kind of a thwarted lover kind of thing here. This one-time hero of Luther, Luther now just scorns Erasmus. Erasmus took it from both sides. Obviously, there were Catholic, what people I would call from the Catholic bubble, who were very much upset with Erasmus for saying anything that would acknowledge the need for reform in the church. So he was in that good position of being in the middle of screaming parties. One other thing to note here, he was a proponent of lay access to the Bible, and so again, this shift where the Christian humanists of the North are now their focus. Though they read Cicero, they read Aristotle, they loved these thinkers, but here the Christian humanists of the North, they're looking at the Bible first. They're looking to the patristic tradition, the fathers of the church. They're trying to revitalize religion. And it's important for them that the people of God have access to Scripture, which was indeed frowned upon by clerics by Rome at the time. So, for various reasons. One of the great works that he's known for still is In Praise of Folly, Encomium Moriae, which is a pun off of St. Thomas More's name, a lifelong friend of Erasmus. And I mean, that's poignant because, of course, St. Thomas More is a man who, having been thrust into the very heart of English politics, will be killed because of his own devotion to, not his unwillingness to break from the Catholic Church when Henry VIII nationalizes the church. He writes this massive book of adages, one of which gives us the selection we've got, the Sileni of Alcibiades, which is it's a very beautiful piece. It will delight you. And it's based off this notion that the exterior of a thing can be ugly, but the inside can be beautiful. And he's playing with that surface and depth kind of paradox. So one of the things that we can look at as far as in his holding to a moderate course, he can look and see the sequelae of the Lutheran Reformation, right? When Luther nails the 95 Theses on All Saints' Eve in 1517, something is set into motion which will include the Peasants' War, which results in hundreds of thousands of dead peasants in 1524 to 1525. A movement that Luther repudiates. These peasants are saying, look, Luther has said we're free and equal. And Luther says, I didn't mean that. And he betrays the people who were inspired by him in a very bloodthirsty way. He sanctioned the noble slaughter of the peasants. Well, I'm not sure that Erasmus would be any more open-hearted towards the peasants. I would hope he would be, but he did see that, in fact, Luther's precipitous actions opened up a very painful kind of sequence of events. Of course, there's the iconoclasm of the Reformers that many people who follow Luther and then Calvin or the Anabaptists, they would go into Catholic churches and smash the faces off the statues and so on because of the notion that it's not good to have any representations of holy things, or we shouldn't be so supposedly worshiping saints, which is a misunderstanding of what's going on and so on. So there's all this beautiful art that's being destroyed, and just the whitewashing of the murals and so on. And then, of course, another after effect of Luther's break is, a desire to reform the church that needed very badly to be reformed, ending up, if you go the Lutheran route, it kept breaking apart. You have Calvin and the next generation of reformers. You have the Anabaptists. You have Zwingli. You have thousands and thousands of denominations that come up. Now, one can argue that there's something good in not having a central authority that can regiment belief, but then there's something obviously lost when we're not united in a belief. So it's just something to keep in mind when we reform in a way that is zealous. You do get a body count usually, and that's if you look at the Marxists, when they get power enough and you want to just burn the system down, usually things don't go so well for human dignity. One final thing to note is that Erasmus's program of classical study, which you can find in De Ratione Studii, the plan of studies, you've got a way of being learned that would set the pattern for European culture for centuries, up until actually not too many decades ago. Now, it has to be said, I'm very sympathetic to this because I think classical education, along with the great books thing, which we do in the Great Conversation, I think the two, which have often been set against each other, I think the two go well together. But there is a class dimension to classical education, which does need to be noted. That in fact it did maintain, for instance, this kind of Erasmian education maintained a kind of learned British class, for instance, that would keep their position. The goal, of course, in the Great Conversation is to make high culture available to all, and that was Mortimer Adler's vision, or Hutchins' vision, and that is the vision of the Great Conversation. So I would like to say that if one takes seriously that to submit oneself to the study of an ancient language, and especially the ones that are at the basis of so much profundity, the Greek and the Latin classics, that is a way of stilling the spirit, of making one peaceable, serene, and maybe then more apt to meet the crises of the day in a way that is life-affirming and isn't as tempted to do what we're all tempted to do when we're faced with a serious situation. We want our way, we want it now. We like silver bullets, but silver bullets tend to kill people, and it's good to just, in fact, or tend to hurt people at least. It's good to have a way to be in this world to make us more profound, and to not react in a superficial way, in a cliched way, to bring something new to the table. And I think Erasmus still holds up this vision of a Christian humanism, surely, but of a humanism that we don't want to lose sight of, even if we're not believers, because to be a humanist, I think, makes us more humane.